Welcome to this lecture on ethnicity and inclusion. In this lecture, we're going to start by defining race and defining ethnicity, exploring the key differences between these and how these are often misinterpreted. We'll then consider local UK perspectives on race and sport and international perspectives on race and sport, including viewing historical examples such as the British Empire, the Berlin Olympics under Hitler, and apartheid in South Africa. We will then discuss stereotypes in sport and physical activity surrounding race and ethnicity and how these impact people, before finishing by understanding what legal frameworks there are in the UK that we need to be aware of, and current governing body initiatives aiming to resolve some of these issues. As a starter task, you should spend 5 to 10 minutes researching recent or current examples of racism in society and racism in sport. Once you've found some examples of racism, you should try to find examples where a sport lacks diversity based on ethnicity, and then a particular role such as coaching or refereeing or even a playing position which lacks diversity in a sport of your choice. Try to find examples or statistics to back up what you found. To do this, you'll need to pause the video as this is about to move on to the next slide. There are a range of contending perspectives on what constitutes race. However, if we use the Oxford Dictionary as a useful starting point, then we understand that race includes biological and cultural factors. For biological factors, the Oxford Dictionary states each of the major divisions of humankind based on particular physical characteristics. And for cultural, the Oxford Dictionary states a group of people sharing the same culture or language, etc. To help us understand this more, Craig and Beattie discuss race as referring to a set of social relationships that permit individuals and groups to be assigned various capacities and competencies, but that these were on the basis of a number of biologically identified features. So to summarise race, it is an arbitrary term based on presumed genetic distinctions. Race is often perceived as something that's inherent in our biology, and therefore inherited across generations, including physical, behavioural, and cultural attributes. Race is viewed as narrow, misinterpreted, and unhelpful by some now. Therefore, ethnicity is often used instead. Now, DNA testing shows that there is no pure race, with people inheriting a mixture of a range of races through generations and even back to our ancestors. So ethnicity is to do with a group of people who have a common national or cultural tradition. Nationality refers to the origin of birth as opposed to present nationality, although this is debatable as some people will move at a very young age or move frequently and identify with a culture which is different to their origin of birth, for example, belonging to a non-Western cultural tradition. Ethnicity refers to a socially and culturally defined social group based on their sharing of a common language, cultural values and tradition and religion. Ethnicity is therefore something we acquire or something we self-subscribe to, based on factors like where we live or the culture we share with others. The common features that people can share in regards to ethnicity include ancestry, appearance, dress, cuisine, heritage, history, language or dialect, and religion, amongst others. Groups often see themselves as distinct, and they are. And ethnicity is a contemporary term which is often used instead of race, although a number of organisations use race and ethnicity as a joint category rather than removing race. So to summarise, race is often perceived as something biological or physical, which is inherited across generations. Ethnicity is typically understood as something we acquire or self-ascribe to based on factors such as where we live and the culture we share with others. Ethnicity, therefore, is more of a socialization process. So we're now going to focus on the second objective of this session and explore local and international perspectives on race and sport. And we'll start by looking at the British Empire. One of the most obvious and to the 21st century mind most ridiculous and annoying traits of the Victorians, or 19th century Britain, was their innate sense of the superiority of the British over the inhabitants of other countries, including Europeans. Many publications from upper-class Britons and travellers demonstrate this. The huge British Empire allowed the British to disseminate our own British values abroad. This included both sport and culture, imperialising both. Essentially, this can be viewed as playing the game on our own terms. For example, cricket is a game which is mainly played in Commonwealth countries. Indeed, the current Test match nations, England aside, are India, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, the West Indies, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Zimbabwe and Ireland, most of who are still part of the Commonwealth, and all of which were part of the British Empire in some way. Cricket was spread to these nations in part through the British Empire, with soldiers from the islands playing the game when on military tours in India, Australia, South Africa, among other countries during the 19th century. Some of the traditional international landmarks in the race-sport debate, which we'll discuss next, are the 1936 Olympics, the 1968 Olympics, and sport and apartheid in South Africa. The 1936 Olympics were branded as the Hitler Games, as Hitler was using the Olympics to showcase his vision of the Aryan race society. The Nazi government in Germany used these Olympics to promote an image of a new, strong and united Germany, whilst masking the regime's targeting of Jews and Roma populations. This was the first ever modern Olympic Games where countries called for a boycott for human rights abuses, with the US and Europe requesting this, but ultimately failing and then still taking part. Jesse Owens represented the United States as a black athlete in these Olympics, winning 4 gold medals to embarrass Hitler and the Nazi government, but also his own population, as black athletes were not generally accepted in the US at the time. The 1968 Olympics are known for the Black Power salute by US athletes Tommy Smith and John Carlos. Beyond the establishment, the resonance of the image could not be overstated. The Black Power movement had provided a post-civil rights rallying cry, and the anti-Vietnam protests were gaining pace. That year, students throughout Europe, East and West, had been in revolt against war, tyranny and capitalism. Martin Luther King had been assassinated, and the US had been plunged into yet another year of race riots in its urban centres. Just a few months earlier, the Democratic Party convention had been disrupted by a huge police riot against Vietnam protesters. A few weeks before the Games, scores of students and activists had been gunned down by the authorities in Mexico City itself. The sight of 2 black athletes in open rebellion on the international stage sent a message to both America and the world. And John Carlos shares how the 50,000 spectators fell silent as they raised their fist, then booed and shouted racist abuse at both athletes. And both athletes were subsequently suspended by the US and from the Olympic Village. And finally, we'll explore sport and apartheid. South Africa were banned from the 1964 and 68 Olympics due to apartheid. Apartheid was a government policy in South Africa which sanctioned racial segregation and allowed political and economical discrimination against non-white people, giving the minority white population more wealth and an increased political and social status in the country. This wasn't a government not dealing with unfair inequality. This was a government actively pursuing inequality based on race. The International Olympic Committee then expelled South Africa in 1970. Now, interestingly, New Zealand's rugby team continued to be involved with South Africa, including touring the country in the 1970s, leading to African countries demanding New Zealand to be suspended from the Olympic Games in 1976. And when the International Olympic Committee refused, those African countries actually withdrew from the Olympic Games themselves. In 1988, the Olympic Committee adopted a declaration against apartheid in sport with African countries, ensuring other international sporting federations cut ties with South Africa to remain an Olympic sport, essentially ensuring complete isolation of apartheid sport. There were a number of other boycotts across the range of sports as well in this time. So from the 1930s through to the modern day, we've seen a change in social values around race and ethnicity and a developing legislative framework within nations, and also internationally across nations to tackle the issues surrounding racism, discrimination and inequality. This includes the work of the Commission for Racial Equality. The CRE was a publicly funded, non-governmental body set up under the Race Relations Act of 1976 to tackle racial discrimination and promote racial equality. On the 1st of October 2007, the CRE was dissolved and its functions were taken over by the Commission for Equality and Human Rights. So we have seen a number of initiatives from private and voluntary sector organisations to tackle this issue, some of which we'll look at shortly. However, yet we still have continued evidence of racism, discrimination and inequality in society manifested in a range of statistics relating to the following: employment with race and ethnicity correlating to employment statistics and the status of employment. For example, full-time, part-time, 0-hour contract, different professions and salary. These correlate with race. There is also evidence that race correlates with education, such as state versus public schools and opportunities across different races, the attainment of GCSE grades, and the likelihood of continuing post-16 education or university studies. There is also a correlation between health and race, which also correlated with increased risk for diverse ethnicities through the COVID-19 pandemic. Race also correlates to housing, for example home ownership, or the number of people in social housing or on housing waiting lists. There is also evidence for race and ethnicity correlating with poorer relations with the police and judiciary systems, for example increased likelihood of being involved in crime and prison sentences. We also still see racial abuse in our society, including through social media. And we still have issues of people being excluded from a range of social and recreational activities based on their race and ethnicity. Now, sport, and in particular football, is still used as a vehicle for the promotion of right-wing political movements. For example, Combat 18. Combat 18 are a far-right group who have close links to the BNP and take their inspiration from Adolf Hitler. The 18 in their name is actually a 1 and an 8, with the numbers referencing the alphabet. The 1 is an A and the 8 is a H, referring to Adolf Hitler. This group have been closely aligned to football hooliganism, with organised fighting with others through football, and you can use the link below to find out more. We also see physical and verbal abuse aimed at players and other spectators based on their race and ethnicity in sport, but again mainly through football. And there are also hidden forms of racism in sport, mainly manifested through inequality, which we'll explore next. So racial stereotyping is an issue in both society and sport. Racial stereotyping is where assumptions are made regarding the sporting strengths and weaknesses of particular groups based on their race. We'll look through some examples of that shortly. Institutional racism also exists in sport, where racism exists in sporting bodies hierarchy. If you want to see an example of this, or at least where claims were made about racism within the structure of sporting bodies, you could search for the Yorkshire Cricket institutional racism claims in 2021. There are also issues with the major sport governing bodies around ethnic diversity at boardroom level. The first racial stereotype we'll consider in this is the stereotype that black people can't swim. At this point, I'd like you to pause the video and spend a few minutes thinking about why this stereotype exists. And then if there is some truth to this statement, is this because of physiological reasons linked to race, or environmental reasons such as cultural traditions? You can pause now, and then when you play the video, we will move on to the next slide. These racial stereotypes not only lead to a continuation of the inequality we see in sport based on race, but they also have an impact on people in society too. This story of 6 African American children dying by drowning from 2010 in the US is an example of how. In the US, the rate of African American children who die from drowning is 3 times higher than from white people. And just under 70% of African American children surveyed said they had no to low ability to swim. These racial stereotypes not only affect elite sport, but also participation in grassroots sport and in society. We'll now move on to our fourth and final learning outcome about understanding legal frameworks and governing body initiatives around race and ethnicity. In terms of legal frameworks, a useful starting point is the Race Relations Act of 1976. This act made it unlawful to discriminate against people based on grounds of race, colour, nationality, including citizenship, so where they live or where they might have a passport to, and national or ethnic origin. The Act covers employment, education, training, housing, and the provision of goods, facilities, and services. So it's sad that this was legislated in the 1970s, but still today we see strong evidence that people are disadvantaged based on their race, colour, nationality, and national or ethnic origin in relation to employment, education, training, housing, and the provision of goods, facilities, and services. In 2000, the Race Relations Act was extended to prohibit racism in all functions of public authorities, and public authorities have a duty to monitor this. The Equality Act of 2010 merged 9 main pieces of separate legislation, including the Race Relations Act, and now makes race and religious belief a protected characteristic, making it illegal to discriminate against someone based on their race or religious belief. In addition to government legislation, we've also seen governing bodies create initiative to tackle racism and discrimination in sport. The first initiative is to explore the group Kick It Out. This group are a response to concerns about football as the focal point for racist activity. They face a significant challenge of how to implement and affect change, particularly due to low funding. This group have been established for a long time, and critics would argue that they haven't actually changed much. However, others would view this more as an issue of society which is manifesting itself in sport, and until organisations such as Kick It Out are funded properly, their impact will continue to be low. The next initiative is Show Racism the Red Card. Playing on the red card being removal from the game for a player in some sports, therefore trying to remove racism from the game. As we said previously, how impactful has this initiative been, and some of the same arguments from Kick It Out are apparent in this particular initiative. And finally, since the horrific killing of George Floyd by a police officer in 2020, we've seen sports athletes take the knee in a fight for racial equality. Colin Kaepernick was actually taking the knee during the national anthem in American football in 2016. However, this was publicly disregarded by then American President Donald Trump and not given much traction by so many in the US. Whilst this has gained traction in the UK, there is also significant opposition here, and some would argue that this message is having no, or at the very best little, effect on racial equality. Therefore, we can summarise that governing body initiatives aren't having the desired effect yet, and even though we have strong legislation against racial discrimination in the UK, the evidence still strongly shows this is an ongoing issue.